All right. Okay, so we just did the old school way of having a button, using the storyboard to instantiate a new view controller, let that view controller know about a piece of data, right? And then have that view controller in its view did load associate that piece of data with a label when it first became available. Everybody, does that make sense for that work through? Widgets like labels and stuff are not available until after viewDidLoad gets called. And viewDidLoad has not been called yet. Here. viewDidLoad won't, because keep in mind that this view controller may never actually get displayed. So not until we actually tell it to present itself will viewDidLoad even be put onto the stack of something it should be called. Okay? So at this point right here, we don't have access to a label. So the best I can do is set that count variable and then make sure we tell Screen2VC to set his label equal to the current value of count once he has access to it. Now, let's look at the new fangled way of doing this. We'll create another view controller and another button so we can go to a Screen3 VC. So we'll go to our storyboard. At first, you're really going to like this. So I'll drag a new view controller out here. And I'll go ahead and I'll throw my navigation bar here. And we'll call this guy Screen3 VC. Then I'll go ahead and drag another button out here. We'll call this guy Launch Screen3. And then I will highlight that button, and I'll do Control-Click and just drag down here and let go. And say Show. Done. Now I have a button that will launch Screen3 VC. If I go ahead and hit play here, we'll see that Screen3 VC shows me Screen 3. That was quick, right? Took no time at all to go ahead and get that next screen to show up there. On top of that, we have the added benefit that we get this nice little line here that shows that this button gives us what's called a segue over to this Screen3 VC. Make sense? So right off the bat, we'd say, oh, that's better, right? We'd say that's better. Let's do a little bit of our extra work here just so we can give ourselves a code behind for this guy. Because right now he's a generic UIViewController, so let's give ourselves a Screen3 VC. So I'll go ahead and right-click on this guy. We'll say New File, Cocoa Touch Class, Screen3 VC, which is going to be a UIViewController. All right, we'll go ahead and steal that name here. Go over to our storyboard, and we'll let the identity inspector for Screen3 know that he is no longer a generic UIViewController. He is now a Screen3 VC. Okay? And we can run it again. The same exact thing will happen. It'll still work the way it worked. But now let's say that I want to give this guy a label. All right, and I want to give him, so I need to set up Screen3 VC to have an outlet for his label. All right, so we'll go over to Screen2 VC, we'll steal his outlet, and we'll call him Screen3 label. All right, so that's in there now. And then we can go back to our storyboard. We'll go ahead and hook that guy up now. So we'll click on Screen3. We'll go to the connections. We see Screen3 label right here. Drag it down here. Now that guy's connected. Okay. So now really Screen3 VC and Screen2 VC are pretty much the same thing, right? We just get to Screen2 by instantiating an instance of Screen2 VC using the storyboard. This guy over here, we don't get to him by creating an instance using the storyboard. Instead, this instance is created for us, okay, by something here called a segue. Now, what I'm going to do, I need to click on this guy right here. Notice I've highlighted the segue itself, okay? And I go up here, click on the little shield, and this is the storyboard segue. I can give this guy a unique identifier. So maybe I call this guy Launch Screen 3 VC. All right, so that's going to be the unique identifier for that segue. So if I happen to ever need to uniquely, let's say that this view controller screen, this first one, had a whole bunch of segues coming out of it. Right now we only have one. But if you might have 2 or 3 or 4 segues, you might need to uniquely identify which segue you're currently working with so you can do the right logic associated with it. All right, so in this case we only have one segue, so we didn't actually need to give this guy a name, but we'll name it anyways just so we can see how this works. Okay, so I would like to let this guy know about his label. Okay, I'd like to let this guy know about his label to set it to that count. We were not given the opportunity, like we were here with the Show Screen 2 button pressed, because this was an event that we controlled. That segue is an event that happens on its own. So we have a function which, interestingly enough, Apple, for several versions of Xcode now, has not included this in their initial template. So not only do they give a crappy name, they don't give you a fully functional template for this first view controller. And I'll prove this to you. If we go down to screen 3, we go down and see this little commented out section here. This is the code you would need to access those segues. So I'm actually just going to copy that real quick. I'll paste that into my view controller, just down here at the bottom. All right, and then what I'm going to do real quick is I'm just going to do a little print statement that just says here. I'm going to throw a breakpoint right here. If you've never used a debugger before, don't worry about this for a second. I just want to prove to you that we get to this line of code. So a breakpoint will make my code pause rather than us having to search for the word print pointed out somewhere. Okay? So we're going to see that when we use the second button, the segue that takes us to screen 3, since that guy is a segue, it's going to call this prepare for segue function. Okay, that's gonna occur. All right, and when that guy occurs, I have a little breakpoint here which is going to tell my code to pause. Similarly, what we'll see is when I use the other button to go to screen 2, which does not use Apple's Segway system, this code will not get called because all that's happening in code we wrote. That make sense? So Apple has introduced, if you want to use their easy connection Segway stuff, you have to then, if you want to interject something on your way to that other screen, you have to use this little lifecycle method for handling a segue while it's in progress. That makes sense? Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. And we'll see that when I click on the segue button, it stops in here. So there's screen 3, and it paused here, proving that we got into this code. All right, so I'll go ahead and hit play there. So we're all convinced that we got into that code now. I'll take that breakpoint off. I'll run this again. Oh, actually, I'll leave that breakpoint on. I'll run this again. We'll click the other button. We'll see it does not stop, proving that segues only get called when we use Apple's shortcut control drag to get to another screen. So we see it did not happen when we did that one. Okay. All right, so now what we'd like to do is we want to do something specific as long as this is the segue we think it is. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and create a little if-else structure. So I'm going to say if segue.identifier is not equal to nil. So if we actually have an identifier for this segue, then if segue.identifier is equal to, so this says, trust me, there is an identifier. I'm checking to see if it's equal to the identifier that we named. So I'll go back out to my storyboard real quick. I'll click on that segue. Here is the name of that guy, launch screen 3VC. We'll go back into View Controller. So I'm saying if the current identifier that we're looking at is equal to launch screen 3VC, then I know I need to do something special. Now the reality is we know that in our current version of the code, this prepare for segue function will only ever get called one time. It'll get called the one time that we have our one segue. So this is really just showing you how you can ask those questions. Is this the segue I'm interested in? Okay, so if I'm looking at the launch screen 3VC segue, then I want to go ahead and try to set his label to count. So what we're exploring here is, if I'm in this segue, has the view already loaded? All right, so rather than giving him a count variable like we had to do before, I want to go ahead and get my view controller. So I'm going to say let VC equal to segue.destination, which is a view controller. And this guy is going to be as a screen 3 VC. And then I'm going to set the text of that guy equal to self.count. All right, so if I know this is the segue I'm looking for, I'll go ahead and create a quick variable called VC, and I'm going to set it equal to the destination view controller that we're on the way to. So I can ask the segue to tell me about the view controller we're going to, and its name is destination. I'm going to say, because I know about this segue, trust me, he's a screen 3 VC. That's the type of view controller he is. Therefore, I want to go ahead and try to set that view controller's labels text equal to the current count. So this is going to let us know where in the life cycle a segue actually occurs. Has viewDidLoad already been called? If it has been, then we will be able to directly set its label. If it has not been, we're going to have to do the same thing we did before by setting a variable like a count equal to the value, and then in viewDidLoad have it set that guy equal to, have it set the label to that value. All right, so let's go ahead and run this. Now remember earlier I made some mention about before you decide some certain code doesn't work, make sure you're getting into the code. So again, I'm going to throw a little breakpoint in here that just proves that I'm getting inside this if statement. Okay, so I'll go back out here and I'll click this a couple times. We have a count of 5. I'll do launch screen 3. We see we are in this if statement, so we detected that this segue has an identifier. Specifically, it's the launch screen 3 VC identifier. So what am I going to do? I'm going to grab the destination view controller and try to directly set its labels text. So I'll go ahead and hit play here. And notice it's saying we found nil. We tried to grab this guy. So yes, VC has a variable called screen3label, but viewDidLoad had not been called yet. All right, so we don't have an advantage from that perspective here. Prepare for segue happens before viewDidLoad as well as when we instantiate it from the storyboard. So I'm going to have to go into screen 3 and pretty much do the same little magic. So we'll give this guy a var count. Start off at -1. Then we'll come in here and we'll say self.screen3label.text is equal to the current value of self.count. And then back here in ViewController, rather than setting the text, we'll set VC's count equal to whatever the current count is. Make sense? So same logic we did before. We're just doing it inside of a prepare for Segway rather than doing it inside of the show screen 2 button press where we did all the work of instantiating the screen we want to go to, letting him know about the current count, and then showing it on the screen. We had to do all the manual work here. It was only 3 lines of code. It wasn't a big deal. In fact, we really wrote more than 3 lines of code down here. But these are 2 different ways of pulling this off. So I'll go ahead and click this a couple times. Now you see we have our 5 there. So I passed that 5 through the Segway. Okay. Now, which do you like better and why? Is there an advantage you see to the Segways versus storyboard, or is it kind of, might they both have uses in different situations? Is it fair to say in a mobile app that there are some situations where we want to have an event, or let's say a button, always go to a certain screen? If we always want to have this one button, no matter when it's clicked, to always take us to some destination screen, there probably are some advantages to the Segway setup. Even though you might say, this little thing here is a bit inconvenient for us. It's not like, we wouldn't say that this is significantly better or worse than that. They're kind of the same level of complexity, right? Up here, you're having to handle the moving parts more independently, where down here, you have to kind of deal with this weird cryptic catch-all function. Let's call it a toss-up. But maybe the tiebreaker comes down to this. In your storyboard, we can visually see the relationship between this view controller and this view controller through this visual segue. There's benefits to that, right? All right, so if we have a button that always goes to a certain destination view controller, Segway makes the most sense. Now, sometimes you might only show a view controller, like maybe this guy here is like an error message. Okay, so he's a view controller that only happens when you've made some mistake on a previous page or something like that, and you're going to pop up this warning or something like that. So with that in mind, having the ability to ask the storyboard to instantiate a destination view controller for you is helpful, because you didn't have the opportunity to use the Segway system. Does that make sense? So both of them have valid uses. It's not one is the new version of the other. Now, you could always use the old school thing where you use the storyboard for creating it, but then you'd lose some of your visual connectivity between your screens. Okay, so now would you say that at the very least it seems like that at the very least it seems a little bit cryptic that we had to set that destination view controller's variable equal to something and then read it? Like, that felt kind of, you didn't want to have to deal with that. Like, maybe we would say, since all we're doing down here is going through all these if statements only to set its count variable, that it might be beneficial to, if that's all we're doing, to not have to do any extra work down here. Wouldn't that be cool? So that's where our Singleton comes in. Okay, and we'll look at this on Android as well. Well, I guess depending on time. I'll make sure I do a really thorough iOS job, and I'll make sure I make all the connections to Android I can. But hopefully you're seeing they're extremely close. There's synonyms on both sides. Because I'm sure you don't want to be here till midnight either. Well, actually, I don't know. I need to rest up for this hackathon. But I could definitely go till 10. All right, so so we say Singleton, and some of you have seen this before. Singleton says it's a good idea to put things that need to be shared among multiple, let's say people, or in our case here, multiple view controllers in a single place. So we have a good example of this right now, right? Both Screen 2 and Screen 3 both have a vested interest, well, I don't know about vested, but have an interest in that count variable. So rather than passing each of those guys independently the count variable, what if we could just throw that count variable someplace else, and then they can both pull that down whenever they need it? That would be beneficial. So let's go ahead and let's write a singleton. I'm going to right click on this guy. We're going to say new file. Now this singleton, you could do this as just a Swift file, but I'm actually going to do the Cocoa Touch class file. That way it does some of the work for me. But I'm not actually going to create a subclass of UIViewController. I'm actually going to go all the way to the top. I'm going to create a subclass of NSObject. Okay, NSObject is a generic, plain Jane Swift object. That's all that guy is. So NSObject is synonymous with just object in Java. I'm going to create a class. You can name it whatever you want. I typically name my if I am creating a project that's small enough where I can get away with like a single singleton. One risk you have with a singleton is that out of convenience, you end up overusing it. So you just throw everything up into the singleton. So it's like super convenient that you have it on every screen, but then you run into the situation where 8 months into the project, you realize you have a singleton with about 300 variables in it that aren't real organized. All right, so you do want to be careful. Again, with great power comes great responsibility, that kind of stuff. So I tend to like naming my singleton something like the word core. I have no idea why. I just started naming it that sometime, and it sounds cool, so that's what we're going to go with. All right. So we'll hit next. I think at some point it came out of like the idea of core data or something like that. I'm not even sure. I think it sounds cool. So you can name it whatever you want. This could have been called elephant. So I have a class called core that happens to be a plain Jane generic NS object. And all I'm going to do in here is I'm going to give this guy a nice little static variable. Static var count. We'll start this guy off at 0. Okay. And by making it static, that means he's owned by the object itself. So I can say core.count. Now what I'll do here in my view controller is I'm going to go ahead, just so I can expose the place where I need to change it, I'm going to delete the local variable here called count. Now you notice I have some errors that popped up. So no longer am I accessing the local variable called count. It's now core.count. Core.count. I will increment core.count, and then I'll set the value equal to core.count. Now, down here, the only reason I even uncommented this code was so I can pass along the count variable, right? I can go ahead. I'm just going to recomment this down here. I don't need to handle the segue anymore. Because what I'll do is I'll go into my screen 2 and screen 3, and I'll get rid of their count variables as well. And I'll have these guys just access course count. Screen 3 doesn't have a local count variable either. He'll just access cores count. So now, no matter what happens on my view controller, every single time I do the click me button, I change my Singleton's value called count by 1. Let's call it a super global variable. That's how you can kind of think about your Singletons. It's available to your entire application across all these different files. Okay, those of you who are currently in 200, you really haven't seen this yet because you've only written applications that had a single file in it, right? At this point, coming up pretty soon, you're gonna be writing multiple file applications in Python. All right, but what we did is say, hey, here's this guy over here. Everybody has access to him. Okay, it's a nice little junk drawer that we can throw stuff. It is dangerous, but for a relatively small application, especially at something like a hackathon, because that's what we're looking at this for. You're not necessarily looking at a project that it might turn into something you end up working on for a while or something like that, but at the end of the day, you got a 12-hour time limit. So any 10-minute little chunks you can save by not having to do passing variables between screen to screen to screen is beneficial. That make sense? So we'll go ahead and we will just store it up in that global variable, and now we have access to it in screen 2 and screen 3. And I never had to deal with the prepare for Segway because of what I was ultimately trying to get to that second screen. So I made it very convenient to get it to that second screen. Oh, this guy doesn't have a... he no longer has that variable, so we just let him become aware of it. So we'll run that. We'll see from our perspective, it still works the same way as it worked before, but now it's grabbing the values through our Singleton. So I'll click on that a couple times. We'll do launch screen 3, and there's our Singleton. Make sense? Okay. So now just for completeness on these guys and just to show you a little trick, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to put a back button on one of these guys. And I am going to show you a danger. If you start getting used to using the segues, one thing you might be tempted to do is I'm going to go ahead and throw a button up here. Now, this guy is a navigation bar, so usually what you would put up here is a bar button item, which is actually this guy down here, but you can use normal buttons if you want to have a picture associated with it, but that's not what I'm really showing you right now. So I'm just going to say back here. A common mistake that might not be the end of the world in your application, but a common mistake that programmers make when they first start using segues is they say, oh, well, I want this back button to take me back to this screen. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hit Control, click, and drag back to the screen. And I'll do show. Get another segue. Okay. Easy peasy. Now I got a back button. So let's go and look at what happens here. Let's see, actually, just to show you what's going on here, I'm going to make one small little modification. I'm going to go into my view controller, and inside of viewDidLoad, I'm not going to default that label to be count is equal to 0. Okay? So it'll be hello world until the very first time we click the click me button. Okay? So you'll see when this thing first launches, it's going to say hello world right now. So I'll do click me a couple times. All right. So we clicked it. Now it says count as 6. I'll go ahead and launch screen 3. It says count as 6. Now I'm going to hit back. And this is going to follow that segue back to that first screen. You see it still says hello world. I didn't go back to the first screen. I created a new copy of the first screen. That when I do the click me button here, because I am modifying that global counter, this is now going to say, I think it used to be 6, they'll say 7 now. Does that make sense? All right, so this guy is using that one global counter, and it still works, but understand that we did not go back to the original screen. We created a brand new first screen. Probably not what we wanted. Okay, we probably wanted an IB action that dismissed the screen to go back to the guy that was previously there. So let me show you that. So we'll go into our screen 3 VC, and I'll go ahead and I'll create an IB action, and we're gonna go. This is gonna be a func. Call this guy BackButton pressed, and we'll say self.dismiss animated true, no completion. So a view controller is allowed to dismiss himself. So when I hit that back button, I connect it up to this IB action, I'm going to tell myself to go away. And whoever had originally presented me will now be at the top of the stack. They'll be the one that everybody sees. Okay? One thing I'll point out for those of you who have maybe done some iOS programming before, but maybe haven't done it in a little bit, you might notice that some of these, some of the syntax looks a little bit different. You previously saw like self.dismiss view controller. I might have said something like that. Over the last, I guess, 8 months, Apple has transitioned from Swift 1.5 to Swift 2 to Swift 3. Originally, to go from Swift 1 to Swift 2 was required, but going to Swift 3 was not. Now everybody's pretty much gone to Swift 3, and Apple handled this whole thing horribly. So many things broke because the syntax is quite different. So if I have like a project from a client from, let's say, a year ago that I was working on, that was probably written in Swift 1.5 from a year ago. Let's say it's that. Something that worked a year ago, if I have to go back and make any changes to, I have to update like a lot of stuff in the project. And all of it's little stupid stuff, and it's all the same stuff. But this used to be called self.dismiss view controller with identifier, blah, blah, blah. It had a bunch of other stuff there. So it was, ultimately it says the same thing. It just says it in a little bit more concise way now. But from a programmer bug correction thing, it says it in a different way now than it used to. All right, so we'll go ahead and hook up this back button. So I'll go back to my storyboard here. And I'm going to get rid of this segue that I created. Okay, so I undid the segue. Do be careful though when you highlight a segue. Make sure you actually have the segue highlighted, not the view controller, because if it starts like yelling at you, like, are you sure you want to like delete like this entire thing? It's not what you want. Make sure you're trying to delete the actual segue. If you're not convinced you're on the right thing, you actually can click on it up here and delete it from up there. Okay, but I've deleted it now, so I'll go to my screen 3 VC, and here's my back button pressed IB action that I wrote. I'll drag it over here to the back button. It's hooked up. Now notice I did not have to choose whether it was a touch up inside or a touch down or any of that stuff, because this was a bar button item instead of a normal plain Jane UI button. They're much more limited, but they're also lighter weight, so they will slow the application down less, although you probably would never notice the difference. So I'll go ahead and run this, and now you'll see the difference here. Remember, I still have it not resetting the label and view did load. So we'll go ahead and click the button a couple of times. So there's a couple of click me's, count as 7. Then I'll go ahead and launch screen 3. I see the 7. Now when I hit back, rather than segueing to present a new screen 1, it actually dismisses itself. You'll see him slide down off the screen, and we'll see count as 7 on that first screen. What I'm looking at right now is the original first screen. I have, in fact, gone back to the original first screen. Okay? Now, would you agree that it's a pretty common thing for view controllers to have a back button in an iOS app? If you're an Android user, your device has a back button built in, right? Okay, so this isn't something you deal with on an Android apps. But because of iOS not having a built-in back button, it kind of makes sense that your applications probably very commonly might have back buttons to go back to the previous screen or something like that. So rather than having to write an IB action in every single view controller, what we can do here is we can write an extension, a class extension. All right, so just so I don't screw up, it's actually pretty simple. I think it's just extension and then the name of the class you're extending. Let me take a stab at it. Test my old memory. All right, so I'm going to create a new file. This is going to be a Cocoa Touch class. Which is going to be fine. I'm going to actually change it in a second anyways. We'll have it come off of NS object. So I'm going to say UIViewController plus extras. A little plus sign in there. This is more of a naming convention because what I'm doing is I'm going to extend the UIViewController class to have some additional functionality. Because instead of, for those of you who haven't had inheritance before, which might be several of you, it would be kind of obnoxious if you wanted to just add one little thing to a class and have to create a brand new, use the inheritance model to create a brand new instance of that class in order to have that one little extra thing. It would be far more convenient to be able to augment the original or augment one of your own classes kind of after the fact to give yourself an ability. So I'm going to name this guy UIViewController, then a plus sign, then extras. That tends to be a naming convention for extensions. I'll add this to my class. All right, and I'm going to modify this here. I think it's just extension UIViewController. I think it's just like this. All right, and what I'm going to do here, let me just show you something real quick before I actually do this. So I'm going to go back to our main storyboard. Well, actually, just real quick, I'll show you in screen 3 VC. Remember, we just wrote this IB action called back button pressed. So now, and that's in screen 3, but not in screen 2, correct? So if I go out to my storyboard now, and I go to screen 3, what I'm going to see here is screen 3 has that action back button press, but if I go to screen 2, he does not. Because I didn't write it in screen 2. If I want to have it in screen 2, I can go and add another IB action inside of screen 2, and now that guy is he has his own IB action, even though they'll both do the exact same thing. They'll tell the current view controller to dismiss himself. All right, so now you have a whole bunch of duplication of code that all do the same crap that a lot of view controllers need to be able to do. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to go ahead and disconnect the one from in here just so we can reconnect it in a second. I'm going to go to my screen 3 VC, and I'm actually going to steal this IB action. Okay, I'm going to cut it from here. So he's no longer going to be part of screen 3. Instead, I'm going to come in here, I'm going to put him in my extension. Just paste him in there. All right, so I have an extension of the class UIViewController, and I've just put an IB action in there called back button pressed. Pretty simple syntax here. So now I'll go back out to my storyboard, and you'll see that screen 2, which never had one before, now has a back button pressed. Screen 3, which used to have one, now still has one, but he's getting it from a different place. You'll also notice that our original view controller also has a back button pressed. Every view controller we ever bring into existence now will have his own back button pressed method because we've extended the UIViewController class. So now it's quite convenient to put back buttons all over the place. If we want this guy to have a back button, we'll just give him the default back button. And if for some reason we need a certain page to do something different than the default, we can write a different IB action for that guy, maybe called, back button alternative or something like that. That does the something special for that screen. All right, does that make sense? So that's more of a trick. That's something that wouldn't necessarily be kind of like a beginner mode type thing, but it might be something that'll help save some time at a hackathon, and it's not very difficult to do. But I do realize I'll put this code up on GitHub or something for you to reference later in case you want to use it as like a cheat sheet or something at the hackathon for grabbing code from. But also I'll be at the hackathon, so if you have a question how to do something real quick, feel free to come and ask. But recognize that I'm giving you a lot of stuff right now, right? So I mean, hopefully you're going to go back and watch this video again later when you need to. Is what it'll come down to. It's going to be difficult to absorb all of this information right now. Okay, so try to keep up the best you can, but you're really getting a lot of stuff in a pretty short period of time. Okay, so questions about any of the stuff we've done so far. We've moved between some view controllers. We've transitioned into some different screens. We've seen some different ways of sending information between screen A and screen B. These are all things that you might need for a mobile app, right? That Singleton trick, you can use that in an Android app. If you don't want to use the Singleton trick in an Android app, Android's version of sending something in is called put extras. That allows you to pack something up with when you launch another screen in Android, you do it through something called an intent. So similar to when we said, present this view controller in Android, we say, create an intent for the activity you want to show, add any extras to it that you might want to send along, and then go ahead and tell the current activity to launch the new activity. It's really the same life cycle for launching a second screen in an Android app. All right. Singleton will also look actually almost identical. In fact, we could use this Swift Singleton here. You would replace the colon with extends and remove the NS. And then you need replace the var with an int and make sure you put a semicolon. You probably don't have import UI kit. And now that's a Java Singleton. So that's your equivalent Java Singleton. So not a huge deal. All right, so next thing we're going to do is we're going to do a table view. So we can see how a list of stuff works. And then finally, we will populate that table view with stuff from a database. So we'll do the table view first, then maybe take a short break. Actually, what I'll probably do, we'll do the table view, and then we'll do our data entry thing. Because what we're going to do here is we're going to have a list of people. So we'll have a screen that allows you to enter in somebody's first name and last name. And then we'll store their first name and last name in a database. Okay? And then we'll have our table view show all those people's first name and last name. So the first thing we're going to do is, how do you show a table of stuff? Didn't come from the database, just a table of stuff. So I'm going to go ahead. Let's just make sure that I didn't break anything here. I think we should be good to go. Okay. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to create another class here. So we're going to say a new file. This is going to be a Cocoa Touch class. And this guy is going to be a UIViewController. All right, so this is a specialized version of a view controller that has some extra methods in it, extra functions built in for doing lists of data stuff and also supports scrolling through things. Okay, and we're going to call this guy, let's call it my list TVC for Tableview Controller. Okay. All right, so there's that guy. We're going to come back to this here in a second. I'm just going to steal the name for this. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to give ourselves this access to this guy in our storyboard. So I'll go out here to our storyboard and I'll come down here. We'll go ahead and put our table view right here. Okay. Now, this guy, notice I grabbed this guy from here instead of the normal view controller we've been using all night. A table view controller is a UI view controller, but he's a bit more. Okay, so he's a normal UI view controller, plays by all the same rules we've been dealing with all night. But he has some extra crap built in that allows him to do some list stuff, okay, table view stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and let this guy know that he is not a plain Jane UI table view controller. He's actually a my list TVC. Okay. So I did that. I'm just going to show you something real quick, just proof that it's already hooked up. But if I click the outlets, notice here that there are two outlets in here, data source and delegate, that are automatically connected for you. You didn't have to do anything special to get these guys hooked up. All right, and we'll talk about those here in a second. So I'm going to go back to my list TVC, and just to make this relatively quick, I'm going to introduce a couple of these methods. So one of the methods that comes with this guy, this is part of the data source methods for a table view, is how many sections is our table view going to have? I'm going to have a table view with one section in it. How many rows are in this section? I'm going to say 100. Okay. So if I were to happen to say 3 sections here, this guy would actually get called 3 separate times. Each time it would pass in which section is it asking for the number of rows in that section for. But commonly you're going to have a single section that's going to be a list of 30 things or 50 things or something like that. Okay, so I'm just going to have 100 things. Then this is a data source method that they commented out, but this is going to be for the actual list of data. So in this case here, this says produce for me the cell for a particular index path. An index path is a section and a row. So in this case, my section is always going to be section 0, and I'm going to have row 0 through 99. So this function right here will actually get called 100 times, and it will produce a different cell each time. Now, for right now, I'm just going to go ahead and hard code in here. I'm going to say cell.textLabel.text is equal to blah. Okay. Now, I'm going to go ahead and run this real quick, and you're going to see it crash. Okay, because this is a common mistake that people who just started doing this make. And it has to do with this reuse identifier, this thing that's just sitting here. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. Actually, before I run it, I need to make sure we can have a way of getting to the screen. So I'm going to give myself another button here real quick. So to go to the storyboard, I'll go here. And I'm going to say show table view. And then I'll go ahead and control click down to this guy and say show this. All right. And so it's going to come to the screen and you're going to see it ends up crashing. And I'll explain why here in a second. All right, so show table view. I click on this, it crashes. Now, this is a tough one because when you look at this, and this is why I want to show this to you, this doesn't give you a really nice error message. It doesn't really tell you what happened. It just says, I got an NS exception. Something bad happened. I really can't be any clearer than that. What actually is going on here, and this is both on Android and iOS, this technique they use, it's for performance reasons. they use, so notice here when we get a cell for the table view, they ask the table view to go ahead and DQ what's called a reusable cell. So let's say you have a screen that at any one point in time can show 8 rows. What it might do is your app might create 12 rows that are in existence maximum. And but even if you're going to show 100 things, it's going to show all 100 things in terms of those 12 rows. So as you're scrolling, only 8 rows at a time are on the screen. So things that are currently off the screen can then be reused to replace the guy up here as you're scrolling through. Okay? So we have to have this unique identifier to grab a cell, with a name, right? Because you might have a single screen that has multiple table views on it, and each of those table views might have cells that have different names. Or you might have a single table view that has more than one type of cell if you start doing custom cells. We're not going to do that tonight, but so typically I just name my cell, and then to connect the dots, this is an MVC thing, out here in our storyboard, down here, I'll go ahead and click on, this is my cell in my table view. And right here we have a thing called reuse identifier. I'll go ahead and paste the word cell in there. All I did is let him know that in code I'm calling his cell, and over here I'm calling it cell. You could have left it saying reuse identifier and then named it reuse identifier over in here as well. They just have to match, but we didn't have this guy in here, which is very interesting because this is a very common, so really the thing that was causing our code to crash was that we didn't have anything in here, which is maybe problematic because you would think that when you first drug this pre-built thing out there, it would give you some sort of warning or something like that, but it does not. All right, so now we'll run this again. You'll see that it won't crash this time. Instead, we'll get 100 rows, 100 cells that each say blah. Okay, there's a little bit more than 8 on the screen at a time here, but certainly we don't see 100 right now, right? So maybe there's 15 or 20 of these that exist right now. So as I'm scrolling, it's actually, what I'm seeing here might be the guy that just left the screen up here with new data entered into it. Okay, so that cell for a row at index path function gets called every single time as I'm scrolling through as a cell is needed. So cell number 99 has not been called yet. I haven't had to call that function yet because I haven't gotten to that. I'm not going to waste CPU power for something the user hasn't been able to see yet and may never scroll down to see. Make sense? All right, but this is our table view. Okay, now, one thing that we might want to do is notice that I've gone ahead and I've shown a TableView controller in and of itself. Now, sometimes you might have an app where you really want the whole screen to be a TableView controller like this, but more times than not, wouldn't you think that you might want to have like a TableView kind of embedded in here? Something like that. So one thing I can do here, so I'll show you a little trick. We can come to this screen directly like we just did. No harm, no foul. But we have this guy down here that's a container. So this guy. We'll put this in screen 3. Now when I drop this in here, it's going to come with its own little view controller, which I think is stupid because I almost always use this for table view controllers, not generic view controllers. So the very first thing I do when he comes with a view controller connected to him is I come down here and I delete it. I don't want that one. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to kind of spread this guy out a little bit. So I have this container. We'll have we want our table view to be embedded in the middle of that view controller right there. So now I'll do a control click from here, drag it over to that guy, and I'll choose the embed option. So I want this view controller that I designed to get embedded in here. So now I can design it separately as its own widget. And you probably wouldn't, you could probably just disconnect this Segway here, even though you don't have to. You're allowed to keep that Segway there if you'd like. Okay, so notice when I have this segue selected, this guy shrinks down to the size of my square up here. When I select this one, he's a full screen guy because that's what he would be. I'm telling it to present on the full screen. Okay, so this guy is serving two different purposes right now. I can display him directly. I can also embed him inside of a different screen. I can embed him inside of multiple screens if I'd like. Okay, but this is a way for me to implement this table view on his own, but get him squeezed into a certain spot inside of a view controller so that I can kind of design around him. I can label stuff or have back buttons or a save button, stuff like that. Does that make sense? Okay. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and run this. It'll take me to screen 3, and we'll see now we have a scrolling 100 cell table view inside of screen 3. Just embedded in there. So there's my screen 3, and here's my table view that is not taking up the entire screen. Do notice though that he did take over the label there. So if I want that not to happen, I probably need to go in here and reset to suggested constraints. And now it probably will be nicer about that label. But understand that working with those layouts is kind of an art. So I wouldn't worry for the hackathon too much about auto layout. Just get it looking the way you want it to look on one device and just move on with life. Okay, auto layout's a pretty easy thing to go back and fix later on, but I would say I'm, I don't know, maybe an A- at working with auto layout, and I've spent a couple minutes working in Xcode. Times like a lot. so you know, it's not something you just learn overnight. It's really not even, half the time it's not logical. It's like little tricks you've learned, like if I do this, then this, then it does what I want it to do. I have no idea why, but it does. Okay, so now we've embedded that guy inside of there. Okay, now just kind of keeping it going here to show you a little bit what you can do with these table views. Let's say that, well, similarly, I can hit back here. I can go to show table view, and it shows me the whole screen as a table view now, even though this is that same screen, right? One of them, he was embedded inside of another view controller, and this one, he's standalone. Now, I might want to click on one of these guys and have it take me somewhere else, right? So maybe I click on one of these rows, and it takes me to screen 2 VC. And that's nice and convenient because I happen to have code that will launch screen 2 VC inside of a button. So if I go back to view controller, this guy here, I can just steal these couple of lines of code. The show screen 2 button pressed. Okay. So I'm going to go now into my list. And before we talked about, we have two different kind of connections that were already set up. We have a data source and we have a delegate. So things like table views, things like collection views, these guys have data sources. That is the dude who fills it with data. And since we're probably not going to do the Android side of this, let me take a couple of minutes to just talk about the connection here. Because we really are talking about Android right now as well. They're the same, okay? So if I talk about lists of data, for iOS, this is called a UI table view. For Android, this is called a list view. All right. A UI table view has a data source and a delegate. Okay. Data source is what data am I presenting? And the delegate is what happens when things are clicked. It's really clicked or dragged. There's a couple different events that happen. But for us, you click on one of the cells, you want something to happen. So delegate is responding to clicks. Data source is what goes in there. On a list view, instead of a data source, we have what's called an array adapter. Actually, it's called an adapter, but the simple version of it, a simple adapter, is called an array adapter. If you want to have more complex, like custom rows, you would use a custom adapter that you build with a layout. It's not that difficult to work with. It's just, instead of calling it a data source, it's called an adapter. It wraps around your data. And instead of a delegate, it has a listener. So you can do an on-click listener for your cells. It's the same thing. All right, makes sense? You know, we have a way of getting the data into the table. We have a way of responding to clicks on both Android and iOS. Okay, so just to show you one of the delegate methods here, I'm going to come in here to our Tableview controller and notice that this guy is a UI Tableview controller, so he already has access to the data source and the delegate methods. Now, not every table view will be clickable, but every table view will have data in it. So they've given us our data source methods, but we would have to go and look up the delegate methods, but one of them is did select row and index path, this guy right here. So that's the one that's like, you clicked one of the buttons, okay? And what I'll do in here is I'll just go ahead and paste that code. All right, so now no matter which button you click, it's gonna take you to screen 2. Does that make sense? All right, so here's my show table view. I can do it from in here. Click on one of these guys. There's my screen 2. If I hit back, it's going to take me back where I came from, not where I originally was in. So it's going to take me back to the table view here, not to screen 1. All right, I actually don't have a way to get back to the original screen from this screen, so I'm stuck, I'm trapped. Now, let's say, so if I go up to the very top, let's say when I click on this very first row, I want to update count. So I want this variable to show 0. If I click on this one, it should show 5 or 6, whatever I just clicked on. You know, so I'm kind of circumventing that whole purpose of count on the first screen and just using that variable again to prove that I can detect the index I clicked on. I happen to know that screen 2 VC, when he loads and view did load, he checks core count. He looks at the value of that variable and says, what is the current value there? I'm going to set my label to that. So that means what I can do here is inside of did select row and index path, I can go ahead and say core.count is equal to index path.row. I can set count equal to whatever row was just clicked on, kind of proving that it was that row that got us there. Does that make sense? We're just passing data around, and we walked past having a logical reason for doing some of the stuff a while ago. Right? So I'll go ahead and do that, and we'll see when we click the first row, and I'll actually go ahead and do this through our screen 3, so we have a way of getting back. So there's row 0, so it shows a 0. There's row 1, it shows a 1. Notice that this guy did not change, though, even though count changed. Why?
Because the button wasn't pressed to update it.
Button wasn't pressed to update it. Okay. Was it the button that updated it?
We changed that.
What we changed was this click me button updates count. But when I go to screen 3, it shows me the current value of count. Now I'm going to click on bucket 1 here, which changes count to 1. Then I'm going to go back, and this is still going to say 9. Why does this still say 9? When did I set this label? In view did load. It happened one time, only when this screen first loaded. If I come into screen 3 VC, and I just take this one line here, and I move it from view did load into another life cycle of maybe view will appear, now it'll set each time this screen is about to show up. Does that make sense? Instead of being a one and done type thing, it happens every single time. Okay, so I'll go ahead and I'll go to screen. Well, here, let's go back here. Click me a couple times. We're at a 6. I'll go to screen 3. We show a 6. I click on bucket 1. It shows me a 1. I go back and it shows me a 1. Does that make sense? So that's kind of the purpose of having that life cycle, being able to interject and do things at different times as we're moving through our app. Okay. Questions about this? Okay. Let's. All right. Let's go ahead and we'll do it off of this screen. So ultimately, what I want to have is I want this screen to be a list of people that I'm going to have stored in a database. All right, so I'm going to put a little plus button up here for adding a new person. Okay, so we're going to go out to our storyboard. I'll throw a new view controller out here. And I'll go ahead and create a code behind for this guy. This guy would be a new normal view controller. So this is a UI view controller. And maybe we'll call this guy add person VC. Like that. And we'll go ahead and let our storyboard know about that guy. And then I'll go ahead and put my little navigation bar up here. Here's my add person VC. And we'll have just for simplicity's sake, when we put this stuff into our database, we're going to have our persons have just a first name and a last name. Okay. So I'll drag a text box out here. And this text box, you could have text in it, but you could also have a placeholder, like in Android, it's called a hint. All right, so we're going to go say first name, and we'll center this. And I'll copy this guy. And we'll say last name for the second one. Okay. Now, the way we're going to get to this screen is I'm going to put a bar button item over here. And there are some system items you can choose from. And one is the add one, which gives you a little plus sign. All right. And then we'll just have this go to this screen right here with our normal segue. So this is how we're going to add something new to our database when we connect it to our database. Okay, now on this screen, if you decide you don't want to do anything, you decide you changed your mind, we'll go ahead and we'll put a cancel button up here. And really, what is a cancel button? It's basically just a normal back button, right? It says, don't save any new data, I'm done. It changed my mind, just go back. So I'll go ahead and hook this guy up to my extension back button press, so it gets me back to that other screen. But I'm also going to give myself a save button. All right, and that save button is ultimately going to save this data to the database. All right, when we connect to the database here pretty soon. I'm picking up the pace a little bit here just so we can make sure we're done by 10, since we're going to start dropping like flies pretty quick. So in any case, what we probably want to have happen, I need to have outlets for these two guys, because when I hit save, I need to be able to read in from my two text boxes, my two text fields. UI text fields is what these guys are, so that I can get the person's first name and the person's last name and ultimately store it in the database. Does I need to be able to read it in. So I'm going to go back to just View Controller here, and I'll steal one of his outlets. And then I'll go to my Add Person VC, and I'll paste, well, let's just paste one of them in first. And let's call this guy first name TF, and this guy is a UI text field. And then we'll call this guy last name TF. He's also going to be a UI text field. All right, so we need to go and hook both these guys up to those two text fields we have out there, because I've made these outlets inside of my Add Person VC. And Add Person VC is this guy right here. And now notice he has a first name TF that we can hook up right there. He has a last name TF that we can hook up right there. Now, realistically, when we first come to the screen, we probably want to go ahead and have our cursor waiting on this guy and have the keyboard already up, right? Because if I just do this right now, if I go ahead and run this, and I get to screen 3, and then I hit the plus button, and I go over to my Add Person VC, it ends up, I'll have to click on that guy. So I'll go to screen 3, I go to the plus. I probably need to update the layout here on this too, but when I click on this guy, that's when the keyboard comes up. Really, we kind of want the keyboard already popped up, ready to go. Keep in mind, this is actually sometimes a weird testing thing, because when you're testing on the simulator like this, I mean, we're not going to sit here and type out on the keyboard on here, right? You're going to type on the real keyboard. And so sometimes you don't want the keyboard in your way. But it's I always like having the keyboard showing up on the screen, because it would be a common practice for you to be testing your app, think everything's good. Then when you go to run on an actual device, you realize you can't get to half your interface, because I can toggle that keyboard off with a shortcut. So I can see all sorts of crap on my interface down here that would be there. But once I run on a device, that keyboard's up. It's blocking that part of my interface. So I like to always have the keyboard actually show up, so you kind of know where your problem areas are. You might want to have your screen slide up to show you the stuff that's missing, or you might embed it inside of like a scroll view, other widgets that we're not going to mess with tonight, but that exist, that you can do stuff to make things move around. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to have this guy automatically be waiting for input. And that will also then make the keyboard automatically show up, and it's a real easy thing to do. So first I'm just going to fix the layout on this guy with the reset suggested constraints. I will then go into my Add Person VC, and we'll go ahead and do this on View Did Appear. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say self first name TF dot become first responder. So by telling that guy to become the first responder, it is as if the user already clicked on the box. Keyboard slides up, it's blinking, it's ready to go. All right, so just making that little change like that, you'll see now when we go there, the keyboard should already be up because I had it toggled, but it's definitely going to already be selected. Sometimes if you do the shortcut thing, you'll forget where you last left it in terms of whether the hardware keyboard is toggled on or toggled off, but you'll definitely see the cursor in there. Yeah, there you go. Okay, so we'll get our first name, we'll get our last name. Now we need to go ahead and give ourselves an IB action for this save button. Let's go ahead and I'll write it like right here. Doesn't really matter where you put it. So IB action, save button pressed. And this guy has to be a function. That is a mistake that I make super often. And I notice right away when it doesn't auto indent for me. All right, so, and what do I want to have happen when I do the save button pressed? Well, you might want to do some error checking to make sure first name had something in it and last name had something in it. What I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to assume there's something in it, but I'm going to show you how to show a pop-up, like an alert. Okay, because we're probably going to end up showing an alert that says data was successfully saved or something like that. So we'll just go ahead and show a quick alert now so we're kind of prepared for finally saving to the database. So I'm going to say let alert equal UI alert controller. And this guy's going to have a title. I don't know, let's say status message. We'll just say about to save self dot first name tf dot text space self last name tf dot text. And preferred style, we have two different choices here. We can have an alert or an action sheet. I'll show you both of these. All right, so that's going to give us that's the tool that ultimately allows us to do an alert. Now, alerts typically also then have buttons on them, like maybe an OK or a cancel or a yes and a no, that kind of stuff. Well, in this case, we're probably just going to have one button, just OK. All right, so I'm going to say let OK action equal UI alert action. The title is going to be OK. Style is going to be, let's say, default. And for handler, I'm just going to put nil. That, again, remember earlier I mentioned something about a closure. The handler is the function that we get called when you click this button. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and put a handler just so you see it. So what we're going to do here is when they hit OK, we're just going to go ahead and say self.dismiss this view controller animated true, completion nil. So it's going to pop up. It's going to say about to save this stuff. You're going to say OK, and then it's going to pretend like it's saved and take us back to the list view. All right, so now I have the alert, I have the OK action. Now I need to add the action to the alert. And then I present the alert just like I would present any other view controller. So I'll say self.present view controller. What view controller? Alert, animated true, completion nil. So when we hit our save button, I have to go hook it up. And when we hit this guy, we're going to go ahead and create an alert whose message should show us what we put in our two text boxes. And it's going to have an OK button on it. And when I hit that OK button, it's going to dismiss the screen, presumably having saved it, even though I haven't actually saved it yet. So let's go hook up that save button. So there's my save button pressed. I'll go ahead and run this guy. All right, so I'll go ahead and launch screen 3. I'm going to go ahead and add a new person. We'll put my name in here. I'll go hit save. Status, about to save Mike Littman. I hit OK, and it's going to dismiss the screen. Presumably saving. That makes sense? All right, so now I have a form for adding a new person ready to save some crap. I also have a table view that presumably could store a bunch of people. So if I update this blah stuff, let's go back to our table view guy here. Instead of just saying blah, maybe it's fname space lname. That would be my placeholder, right? So now ultimately we want these to be real things. All right, so let's just do that. Fname, lname. Do that. Cancel, go back. So what we want to do as our last step is we're going to go ahead and be able to save stuff here, actually have it saved to the database. Then we're going to be able to scroll through here, and when we save it to the database, we should see that change happen in here. So this guy should always be a list of the current users in or the current first name, last names in our database. That makes some sense? All right, let's take another quick break, 5 minutes, run to the bathroom, whatever. We'll then knock out the Firebase stuff, and we'll call it a night. Sound like a plan? All right, so let me get this uploading. That way the last part of the video will be just Firebase stuff.